Welcome back to Proxhammer, everybody, and today we're going to be finally doing the Craftworld Eldar Forgeworld unit review, and we're going to be looking at whether or not any of the Forgeworld units that are available to us are actually worth taking in competitive play and just in games in general. Now, I have tried a couple of these. There are a couple of units that I haven't actually played with. As just a quick disclaimer, there are several units in this review that I'm only basing on the rules. I'm not actually basing on actual experience. So if you guys do have actual experience with any of these models, let me know in the comments. And I'll go ahead and make sure you guys know which models I haven't actually played, in all fairness. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be taking a look at the most popular Forgeworld, Craftworld Eldar units, and we're going to be breaking down which ones are effective in comparison with our own codex units, because a lot of these choices are actually very similar to units that we already have. So what we really have to do is compare the two to see if, it's really worth taking, this Forgeworld unit when we have kind of a unit in our codex that does the same thing, perhaps a little better. So here are the Forgeworld units we're going to be looking at. Now, I'm aware that there are more Forgeworld units out there, but these are the units we're going to be looking at because they're the most common and most popular units. So we're going to be looking at Irillyth, the Shadow Specter Phoenix Lord, Shadow Specters, the Hornet, Wasp Assault Walker, Wraithseer, Lynx, Warp Hunter, and of course the infamous Nightwing. So jumping right into it, we're going to be looking at Irillyth. Now, Irillyth is 140 points, so he's priced well within the range of the other Phoenix Lords. He has a little bit of extra movement at movement 12. He has a very powerful weapon that's pretty much tailored towards killing Terminators. Hits on 2s, wounds on 2s, and does damage 3, so each one of those is popping a Terminator with AP -4. And just like Mangan Ra, he has a very weak melee weapon that's honestly probably just a last resort. This guy really wants to be kind of floating and, shooting enemy Terminators or honestly heavier units. He's not bad at anti-tank either. He can do some significant damage to tanks. And it's funny enough, but he's probably a little bit more consistent than Fuegan at killing tanks at range. And when you look at his abilities, basically just he's very hard to hit and is very mobile. He has -1 to hit from enemy range attacks. It's not just range attacks. It's also in close combat. It's a -1 to hit. He can be set up using essentially the sudden assault ability, which is called Shade of Twilight. And he buffs Shadow Specters, and when enemies are close, he debuffs their leadership. But when looking at most of these special rules, not a lot of them are going to come into play. The Shade of Twilight is probably never going to be used with this guy because he already has a very good ranged weapon that has a decent range. He's not going to be assaulting anybody, and honestly probably doesn't need this ability. And the fact that he's a character means he probably won't honestly be using the Specter Holofield that much either. And in addition, I'm really not a fan of the Reaper of Souls aura. Not Reaper of Souls, sorry, Shadow of Death aura. Because you're essentially never going to want to be within 6 inches of enemies, and -1 leadership is not anything to write home about. It's really just not that great. So it's not an ability that's going to be used that much. I have actually run this guy in a few fun games, and it just never came into play. So I think he's actually a good Phoenix Lord. I just think that, to be honest with you, he's probably not the best Phoenix Lord, and I would rank him probably, to be honest with you, in the middle to lower tiers of the Phoenix Lords that we have in our current Craftworld book. So he is good. He's just not the best. And he's kind of a one-trick pony in terms of his ranged weapon. He can't really do much outside of that. So moving on to his Shadow Specters, though. Now, the Shadow Specters are pretty damn good. I actually like them a lot. Now, they are pretty expensive. They're 26 points a model. Makes them the third most expensive aspect warrior behind Shining Spears and Dark Reapers. So, honestly, they're pretty, pricey as far as their points. They have the same base stats as a Warp Spider. They have pretty good movement and pretty good aspect stats. However, they do miss out on an extra attack, which, to be honest with you, doesn't really matter because these guys will never want to be in combat. Now, as for their ranged weapon, it's a very versatile weapon, has a great range. And when you stack this on top of Battle Focus and the fact that they're a core unit, it makes them potentially very powerful. Their diffuse profile is a slightly worse death spinner, but it has extra range. And the focus profile, I think, is really why you take these guys. Strength 6, AP -3, damage 3 is a very good weapon, but it's a niche weapon. It's only really used for units that are 3 wound plus, or units that have 2 wounds that will negate a wound. So, for example, Death Guard. This is really good at taking out things like Death Guard Marines who do have 2 wounds, but they are at -1 damage. So this unit is very effective at taking out those multi-wounded models. However, they are pretty expensive. So I really think to get the most out of this unit, you might have to buff it and support it properly. They're not really good on their own, and they're definitely not good in certain circumstances if they don't have support. So I think as a niche unit, they're great at killing, Terminator equivalents, but they're also good at dealing with light vehicles and monsters as well. As for their special rules, they're a little bit harder to hit than normal. They have -1 to hit on their profile. So any attack that's directed towards them is a -1 to hit. And because they have battle focus, they can get back to safety easily using that 24-inch range to do so. They can also deploy via sudden assault, which again, probably not the best way to use them. I personally don't like using them this way, but it is an option for you if you need to. And again, they debuff enemy leadership when very close, which is practically useless. Now, I have used these guys in a couple of games, and they're pretty decent. I actually like them a lot. I don't know if they're better than Warp Spiders or Swooping Hawks, though, now. To be honest, the changes with the fact that they're now core means that they can be buffed. But I don't think it's quite enough to compare them in terms of versatility with Warp Spiders or Swooping Hawks. I think Warp Spiders and Swooping Hawks are probably better units in general. These guys are very specifically Terminator and light tank vehicle hunters or monster hunters. And I think that's what really puts them in a position where you're not going to really consider them that much. But I actually do like the unit. And I've honestly found them to be pretty good in casual games. I haven't really played them in a super competitive game or, against an opponent that is, using a very competitive list. But I have used them against, good players in more casual games where we're agreeing to use fun units. And this unit did pretty well. And I think it probably could fit in a, more competitive list in some cases now. But again, I think that that's only if your army really lacks, the ability to deal with models like Terminators or models that have, -1 damage in their profile, like, Death Guard, or even light vehicles and tanks. And honestly, we have so many weapons in our codex that deal with these things very well. So I like Shadow Specters a lot. I think they get a little bit outcompeted by the other fast attack choices in our codex, though. Now, when I come to the Hornet has always been, in my mind, a very popular Eldar Forgeworld unit because it really looks kind of cool and it has really cool weapons. It has a higher movement for an Eldar light vehicle at 18, so it's a little bit faster, and it has slightly more wounds, but it's very expensive. It's 80 points base before its weapon choices, and its weapon choices are honestly nothing to write home about. So when we look at its weapons, the Hornet Pulse Laser, it's actually quite disappointing. It's basically just a weaker Star Cannon. Now, a Star Cannon is a heavy 2, strength 7, AP -3 damage 2 weapon. So when we look at this, it's like, wow, this is just a worse version of that. And it costs 5 points for this thing. So this is a 90-point model that has 2 subpar weapons on it, which is just really not that effective. However, it can change out its Hornet Pulse Lasers for weapons with the Craftworld Eldar Heavy Weapons list at additional points, which isn't bad, but again, you're going to be paying a little bit more for it. Now, I think probably this thing is best with Bright Lances because it is hard to hit, and it kind of acts as on a harassment unit, which is great at taking out vehicles and things like that. It does have -1 to hit from enemy shooting attacks, but I have to say, this is one of those units I don't think is competitive. And the reason why is because we have so many units in our codex now that are better at doing it. And by the way, Vipers. I know that, I've kind of changed my mind a little bit about Vipers as far as as far as their competitiveness. I think that, having a Viper in your list here and there is not a bad choice, for body blocking and things like that. But the thing about the Vipers, it's very cheap. And at 40 points a model, you have a very decent weapon platform with the Viper. With this thing, you're paying way too many points for essentially just an extra heavy weapon and a tiny bit more movement. So I really don't think this thing's worth it. As far as its special rules, it really doesn't have a lot. It doesn't have any kind of ability where it can kind of jump into the battle via a cloud strike or something like that. It doesn't have any kind of, special shooting ability where it gets to shoot more or anything. It just has those 2 weapons, and that's basically it. So I think in general, the Hornet is just too expensive to consider in competitive play. And I think it looks cool. Here's the thing. It's a cool looking model. And if you're just wanting to have fun, I think there's a way to make this thing work. I just, honestly, it looks like to me, with this model, the problem is it just doesn't have a lot of impact. However, I think if you gave it 2 Bright Lances, and if you just made it kind of a light tank hunter that was hiding behind terrain, hunting tanks a little bit, I don't think it could be that bad. But again, I'm just not very impressed by it. Now, that changes when I talk about the Wasp Assault Walker. So here's the thing about the Wasp Assault Walker. When you look at its stats, it's essentially Warwalker stats. It has 1 worse save, and it has a lower attacks profile. But basically everything else is the same. The save, not that important, and the attacks really aren't that important. But it's 5 points less base than a Warwalker. So it's a little bit cheaper than a Warwalker, and its special rules are really when it comes into play. It can take all the Craftworld Eldar heavy weapons, just like a Warwalker. It has a 5+ invul save, just like the Warwalker. But here's the thing. It has battle focus. Now, this may be a case of these rules for this thing haven't been updated because it still has the Ancient Doom special rule. And I'm just thinking that maybe this thing's outdated and can't actually be run in games anymore. But it seems pretty good, as far as its rules go. So if these are the updated rules, they look pretty good to me. Now, of course, I may be completely wrong about this. Now, in full disclosure, I've never actually run Wasp Assault Walkers. I've never actually had them as a unit. I've considered them a few times, but I never actually went out and bought them. So my thing about this unit is that on paper, they look pretty good, but I don't know if the rules for them are up to date, and honestly, I don't even know if the rules are out there for you to legally take them in Craftworld Eldar lists anymore. I'm not sure about that. If you can leave me a comment about the Wasp Assault Walkers, I'd really appreciate it if anyone knows anything more about it. But basically, yeah, these guys are pretty effective. They have battle focus. They have the ability to be set up as reinforcements via pretty much sudden assault. And honestly, they're pretty good models overall. I think, if these guys are in fact a legitimate unit that you can take still, because I knew you could take them in the past, but if you can still take them and they have updated rules and everything, I definitely think that this is a unit that could be used in semi-competitive games, because to be honest with you, it's good. It does compete with some of the other fast attack choices, in my opinion, in the Eldar Codex, and it really does a good job of, playing to the Eldar strengths, moving, shooting. So you could move these guys, behind terrain, shoot and scoot all game long because they have battle focus. And I think that really makes them a potentially powerful unit, especially with things like Craftworld traits and stuff like that. You could have these guys really being really effective in certain lists, like Uthway and things like that. So definitely think Wasp Assault Walkers are a unit that are potentially very good. Now we get to the Wraithseer. Now the Wraithseer, believe it or not, is a unit that I've used a lot. I like the Wraithseer a lot. In fact, I used to run 2 of them in a purely Iandin Wraithguard Wraithlord list way back in the day, where I had 2 Wraithseers. They were kind of in place of Wraithlords back then, but the cool thing is now you can take both. You can take both the Wraithseer and the Wraithlord in the same list because the Wraithseer is heavy support now. So in terms of its melee weapon, it has the Ghost Spear, and it is also equipped with a Wraith Shield, which is very good. It has the same stats as a Wraithlord, and it's about 30 points more base than a Wraithlord, so it's not that much more expensive. We're not looking at something obscene here, like a 200-point model base. So that's why I really think that the Wraithseer might have a lot more room in competitive play in this edition, especially with the changes to Forgeworld units, making them more in line with the Codex. So the cool thing also about the Wraithseer is it can take a D cannon, and a D cannon is exceptionally effective on this platform. It's very good. So I think it's worth taking the D cannon personally. I think it's a no-brainer choice. Not only is it good on the platform, but it basically does really heavy anti-tank damage that a Bright Lance just cannot compete with. Now, as far as the Ghost Spear, it does consistent damage at 3 plus D3. It's nothing to write home about. It's no Ghost Glaive, but it is still effective at dealing with heavy infantry and vehicles. And it has access to all the other Craftworld Eldar heavy weapons, but it can only take 1. And to be honest with you, I think you should probably be taking the D cannon with this guy. I think it's just much better in terms of damage and in terms of just general destruction. As far as his other war gear and options, he has the Wraith Shield, which gives him a 5+ invulnerable save. Absolutely immensely powerful. Gives him much more survivability, especially alongside Wraithbone Form. Makes the Wraithseer extremely durable, more so than regular Wraithlords. And he's a Psyker. He can know and cast 1 power from the Runes of Battle and can deny 1 psychic power as well. So I actually think that the Wraithseer is probably one of the more powerful and competitive Forgeworld units, especially if you want to run something like a Wraith Army. And honestly, this guy's good in non-Wraith Army lists. This guy can be very good and can be a decent replacement for a Wraithlord if you need some extra psychic power, or if you want to bring the all-powerful D cannon and want a little bit more survivability as well. This is a great choice for a lot of different lists, in my opinion. And I've personally run this guy in a lot of my own lists, and to be honest with you guys, I think he's a great model. He does great work. He's not as good in combat as a Wraithlord is, but he's still good enough to support your units in the backfield, and the D cannon is a blast to use. It's super fun. No pun intended, it's a blast weapon. But it's just really, it's really a cool weapon. It's on a really... It's, really on a good platform, which is the Wraithlord. So I'm a big fan of the Wraithseer. I think it's a fantastic model. It looks cool, and it has great rules, and it's not too overcosted. 30 extra points for giving it the Psyker Special Roll and a 5+ Invul save is very cost effective. So definitely consider taking the Wraithseer if you really like Wraith units. The Lynx, on the other hand, I think is a common Craftworld Eldar Forgeworld unit. I've personally never used it, I'll be honest. But when we look at its stats, it has slightly higher movement and wounds in a Craftworld Eldar grav tank. It looks a little different too. And it's at the hefty price point of 220 points base. So it's very expensive. And it's a little tougher and it's a little faster to make up for it. Now, it is armed with an extremely powerful weapon, and if you've ever seen what the Lynx actually looks like, it's basically an Eldar grav tank kind of split with the gun down the center. And the Lynx Pulsar is a heavy 6, strength 9, AP -3, damage 3 weapon, great against Terminator equivalents, vehicles, and monsters alike. And it's armed with a shuriken cannon as backup. So, pretty good weapon options as far as that goes. Nothing to write home about. But the weapon isn't weak, let's just say that. So the shuriken cannon can also be replaced with another weapon from the Craftworld Eldar heavy weapons list. So if you want to make it a little bit more specialized to deal with anti-heavy infantry, like its profile suggests, you can give it a star cannon, or if you want it to hunt tanks a little better, you can give it a bright lance or something like that. So it's a little bit flexible as far as the weapon option that you can give it, which is nice. But yeah, essentially, when you look at its special rules, it has a 5+ invul save against range attacks, just like the Wave Serpent. Not bad, but it doesn't have the Serpent Shield. And it can advance extra fast. Now, to be honest with you, though, I don't know if you're going to be wanting to advance with this thing, because then you can't shoot with it. So it's kind of a wasted rule, in my opinion. You could advance 12 inches instead of the normal 6 inches, which is nice. But again, why would you want to do this and sacrifice its shooting? So I think it's a little bit of a missed opportunity here from GW as far as, basically making the rules aligned and so forth. But I have to say, I haven't actually played with this thing. If you guys have some experience with it, let me know in the comments. Now, personally, though, looking at its profile and what it can do, I don't really like it that much. I don't think it can do anything that our units for 220 points can't also do. And a little bit better, to be honest with you. For example, I can't see, this thing doing better than Dire Vengers, or better than, for its points for a Fire Prism. You know what I mean? Now, it does do better against Terminator equivalents, but when you think, okay, well, but for its points cost, is it effective? As effective against Terminators and light vehicles as other units in our army can be. And I just don't see it, really. But again, I could be wrong. This could be a very good niche Terminator killer unit, and that I just haven't seen the potential of in battles. So let me know in the comments what you guys think of it. If you have used the Lynx, please let me know. Personally, I don't think it's that competitive. And, I think it looks kind of weird, to be honest with you. Kind of looks, some people could think it looks cool. I guess that's a subjective thing. But, my opinion is that it looks kind of strange, honestly. So, but let me know in the comments what you guys think about this. Its heavy pulsar is very good. I'm not knocking the weapon itself. I'm just knocking the fact that it's so many points for what you get. And I think, to be honest with you, when you consider the points cost, the Lynx pulsar looks a lot less enticing. So on to the Warp Hunter. Warp Hunter has average grav tank stats at 195 points, which is really expensive considering a Fire Prism is just 160 points. And that kind of threw me off at first because it's armed with the D-Flail. So we really have to determine, okay, how good is this D-Flail? Is it in fact better than a Prism Cannon? So let's go ahead and take a look at that. So when we look at the D-Flail, its weapon is powerful, but it's very short range. It's essentially a D-Cannon. And it has indirect fire. So in terms of damage, though, it's not that much different than a Fire Prism. It does have indirect fire, but it's heavy, basically damage dealer, which is the heavy D3, essentially a D cannon. To me, it's really just not that impressive. And when I'm looking at this thing, I'm thinking, wow, a Fire Prism does a lot more damage than this against tanks. Yes, it has indirect fire, but a fire prism also has more range, can be in a safer spot while it's attacking. And honestly, that can be just as useful as having indirect fire if the indirect fire is very short range, especially on a model that's 195 points. Now, it does also have the Rift, profile, which is a heavy 3 auto hits. And it does more or less kind of the same damage as, the blast option. Just a D6 instead of D3 plus 3, which on average won't get you as much attacks, but it's, or as much damage, but it is an auto hit. So that's decent, but it's range 12. You really have to put this thing in harm's way to be able to utilize it, and I just don't see it being that good for that many targets. I have to admit, even tanks, there are just better options for dealing with tanks. Fire prisms do more damage and have access to the linked fire stratagem if you have 2 of them, and are much less points than this thing. So I really think this thing was a miss as well. I don't really like it just based on its profile. Again, though, I haven't used this model. This is one of the things that I haven't used as far as Forgeworld goes. So if you do have any comments on this, or you have any kind of insights on this model, please let me know. I'd love to kind of, hear you guys out and see, if these models are actually effective. Or if they've been effective for you, or, you have any tips or strategies with them. This is just the normal Eldar vehicle. It can take all the, vehicle upgrades. It can upgrade to a shuriken cannon, and essentially it has no other special rules. So lastly, we have the Nightwing. Now, the Nightwing is essentially Crimson Hunter stats with a couple of extra wounds. It does come in at 220, which is an increased amount of points. It's armed with the twin Bright Lance and a twin shuriken cannon. Without upgrades, it will be more expensive than a Crimson Hunter, but not more expensive than a Crimson Hunter Exarch that's fully kitted out. So let's see if it actually does a better job than the Crimson Hunter at killing its targets. So it's armed with a twin Bright Lance and a twin shuriken cannon. These are fantastic weapons for taking out other aircraft units. But it doesn't really have the hitting power to deal with super heavy targets, and it's a little bit less hard hitting, to be honest, against heavier targets than the Crimson Hunter with Bright Lances and Pulse Laser. So honestly, it's probably better suited for dealing with lighter targets in the air, but it has a slew of special rules. Now, basically, I'm going to boil this down for you. It essentially is just all the special rules that flyers have, except that it can advance and maneuver a little bit better, which means that, it won't be often in trouble as much or placed in a bad spot as much as other flyers. It has a 5+ invul save, which is decent, although the Crimson Hunter can get the same thing. And it can hit enemies with the aircraft keyword a little bit easier. And I think the thing is that, the Crimson Hunter is just better against flyers in general. That means that models that have the fly keyword, it gets bonus hits and can reroll wounds. This thing only gets bonus to its hit against enemy aircraft. The other thing is, it can hover, which is kind of cool. Basically makes it a skimmer for a turn, a grav tank on the ground, so to speak. It loses all of its aircraft abilities, but can maneuver a little bit better. But it really doesn't bring a lot of advantages. I mean, I could see you running this thing in hover mode, maybe in the later turns of the game if you need to maneuver into a certain spot, to get out of danger. But if you do that, it loses all of its durability, and, enemies can assault it on the ground. So it's not going to be used very much, but it is an interesting choice, I think, overall. And I do think the Nightwing is a decent model. I just don't think it's that good. And, I think it's actually, believe it or not, I think it's worse than a Crimson Hunter in a lot of ways. So I don't really care for the Crimson Hunter. I did a review video on the Crimson Hunter a while back. I like the Crimson Hunter as far as its model and everything else. I just don't like how it plays, especially in this new codex. I don't think it was given enough attention to make it a powerful choice. And again, the Crimson Hunter is definitely no Harpy. It cannot do the same amount of damage as a Tyranid Harpy or anything like that, or some of the other flyers that other factions have. So, in general, if this thing is worse than the Crimson Hunter, then it's probably not worth taking. I really don't care for it personally. I think the fact that it has twin shuriken cannons is probably more of a fluffy aesthetic kind of choice for an anti-aircraft vehicle. But in game, it's really not going to do that much, and you're much better off going with, if you're going to be anti-aircraft, much better off with going with more anti-tank style weapons like pulse lasers or bright lances or things like that. And, the fact that you can't switch the shuriken cannons out means that you're going to be at suboptimal damage against a lot of different aircraft targets. So really not a fan, but, again, if you guys have found a cool way to use it, let me know in the comments. I'd really love to hear it. So in conclusion, I think most of these Forgeworld units are in a real bad need of an update that goes beyond making them codex compatible, things like giving them core or Craftworld traits, etc. I think a lot of them actually need reworks on some of their rules because they're really just not in line with the power of the codex. For example, the Warp Hunter is a prime example of a model that's probably in almost every way worse than a Fire Prism, except in extremely short ranges. And even then, you could debate that a Fire Prism might be better, just in terms of raw tank killing power. But I think there are a few gems that could be very good if used correctly. And that includes Shadow Specters, which are a pretty good unit. Might be outcompeted by a lot of units in the Codex, but I think are still effective. The Wasp Assault Walkers, and again, I don't know if their rules are current, but as it currently stood on what I read, they're pretty good. And finally, probably the best unit in the bunch is the Wraithseer, just because it's very cost effective for what you get. It's essentially really on par with a Wraithlord, and you get much more survivability, and you're a Psyker. So the Wraithseer is one of those units. And you can take the D cannon, of course. So I think it's one of those units that is actually a surprise and is actually very competitive and can be extremely powerful in a lot of different lists. So yeah, I think in general, when it comes to Forgeworld units, I really like Forgeworld units. I think that just most of them just aren't that good anymore. I think when they came out in past editions, when we had old books and stuff like that, we sometimes relied on Forgeworld units to make up for the lack of power in our codex. But since we have a new codex now, I think a lot of these are kind of falling behind. All right, everybody. Thanks for watching. As always, leave comments and questions that you have in the comments section. I'd love to hear them and respond. And yeah, that's going to be it for today's video. I know this has been a while coming out, but I wanted to do it justice at least. If there's any more Forgeworld units that you guys want me to do a review on, I can try to do that. I wasn't able to actually proxy and try out all the models, but again, let me know if you guys want any more, Forgeworld units done. I'll definitely make it a point to, probably proxy them, to be honest with you, in games, in my future games, and see how they work and just do a review on them. All right, everybody, that's it for today's video. I will see you guys next time. Have a good one, everybody. Peace out. Thanks for watching.